Hello, Adam Gower here, and welcome to the Gower Crowd podcast syndication in the digital age at gowercrowd.com. And today you're in for a very interesting episode with Josh Spector, joshspector.com, who is an expert in newsletters. And he's actually made a business out of sending newsletters. It's absolutely fascinating. Now, we work with clients all the time to perfect their newsletters. So once we have set up their investor acquisition system, we then initiate a bi-weekly or weekly newsletter that keeps subscribers, so these are prospects and active investors, updated on whatever you've been doing, keeps them in the loop and continues to nurture them in between deals. And we've identified 4 different styles specifically for what the initial sequence of emails should look like when somebody first signs up on your website. This is what we call the indoctrination sequence. So that's a sequence of anything from 3 to 12 emails that go out automatically as soon as somebody signs up on your website. Now, Josh has actually developed an entire business that is based entirely around newsletters. I first discovered Josh in an article that he wrote about comedians. Absolutely fascinating. And I'll leave a link to that in the show notes for today's episode. What's particularly interesting about that article, even if you're not a comedian or don't have any interest in comedians, is the way that he structured the article and the way that he promoted it. So take a look at that. It's very, very interesting. While you are at gowercrowd.com and on the show notes page for today's episode, be sure to sign up for my newsletter. We've completely revamped it. We now send out an update on real estate crowdfunding every Wednesday that covers exclusively news and updates and multimedia, so videos and webinars, etc. In the real estate crowdfunding industry, it's exclusively focused on that. As far as I know, it's the only one in the industry that is exclusively focused on real estate crowdfunding. And we have a Saturday newsletter that has in it all kinds of educational content, as well as providing you with access to exclusive opportunities. So that is all there on the gowercrowd.com website, where you'll also find information about my guest today. So let me get on with introducing him. Discover the wonder of newsletters with professional newsletter sender Josh Spector of joshspector.com. Josh Spector, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I have to tell you that in preparation for this podcast, I sat down and I thought, newsletters. All right, what on earth am I going to ask him? I've actually just went through, because your business is kind of different. And I just had a back and forth with one of my clients this morning, negotiating the frequency of their newsletter. Right.
Okay.
I was thinking, right, so what can I ask Josh? So I spent about 2.5 minutes. Actually, that's not right. I spent about half an hour thinking about it. And I've come up, I have to tell you, Josh, with more questions than we could fill 24 hours of solid conversation. So we're going to have to keep it really focused as best as I possibly can. Let's start, because your business is very interesting, your newsletter business, but you are a real expert. Your stuff is just out there, phenomenal.
Thank you.
Let's start at the very, very highest level with the number 101 question. What is a newsletter?
That's one of those simple questions that's way more complicated.
I told you. Right. 24 hours.
I could probably spend 24 hours answering that one. But so I think let me start by saying a newsletter can be what you want it to be. At a very high level, macro level, it is a way to develop a relationship with an audience, and a direct relationship with an audience, and an ongoing relationship with an audience. Now, when people hear the term newsletter, different people make different assumptions about what it is. That's why this is probably a good question to start with. It doesn't have to be about news. There's a woman, Ann Hanley, who always says the letter part is more important than the news part, that it should sound and feel like a letter. But I think there is no one way to sort of create a newsletter. The key is, and I think this is where a lot of people go wrong, is you want to start with what your goals are. The newsletter is a tool to achieve a goal. So what actually matters is what is the goal you're trying to achieve, and then construct the newsletter in a way that's going to help you achieve that goal. So in some cases that might be providing news. In other cases, it might not have anything to do with news. In some cases that might mean sending it daily. In other cases, it might mean sending it monthly. In some cases, it might mean that it needs to be a sort of long, in-depth thing. In other cases, it might be a sentence. One of my favorite, and I don't think he runs it anymore, but one of my favorite sort of newsletter concepts, and I forget the guy's name, but there was a guy a few years ago who had a newsletter that I think was called like 10-second reads. And it was aimed at marketers, and it literally was basically like, essentially he was sharing one link that was like a really good article or something that not even that he had written, it was curated. Here's like the best thing I read this week. And literally the newsletter was a 10-second read. It was like one sentence. And everybody
One sentence with a link.
One sentence with a link, right, to whatever the best thing was that he found. And I think there's an assumption, most people would assume you couldn't do that a newsletter had to be a lot of work and a big whatever thing. But the truth is, all that matters is that you're providing people value. And so I actually always opened and read his newsletter, because the fact that it was so short and simple, as long as he was consistently sending me a thing that was good, it was like a no-brainer. It was actually a plus, as opposed to, you'll see people that are writing these like super long essays, or there's a million links and there's a million stuff, and those can be good. Again, there's no one way to do it, but they can also be overwhelming to people. So I think that's the first thing, is to sort of understand that it can be what you want it to be. It's just got to provide value. It's got to match the audience, and it's got to align ultimately with your goals. The other thing that I would say, just sort of quickly in this kind of definition of newsletter terms, is, and some of this is my own definition, but like I think of newsletter as different than email marketing. And the way I explain there's definitely overlap, but the way I explain the difference is email marketing is something designed to extract value from an audience. A newsletter is designed to provide value to an audience. The irony is, a great newsletter is the best form of email marketing. The more value you provide to them, the easier it becomes to ultimately extract value from them.
Wow.
But those are
Explain what's happening when you do that. It's funny because I'm actually right in the middle of a sentence. Before we started, I cut off. I'm writing an ebook, and the exact point that I left it. Sorry to interrupt you. I really should.
No, go ahead.
When I do that. But the exact point where I left it to get on this podcast was the concept of reciprocation. That when you give value to a prospect, there is this, you create this psychological response in them. They want to reciprocate. They want to do something for you. So I'm putting words into your mouth, and I don't mean, but go ahead and explain, why is it that when you give value in a newsletter, you actually enhance your ability to extract value? Or that's another way to sell something to your recipients.
So I think there's two pieces to that. So the first is that reciprocation that you explained is definitely true, right? There's some human, and I am not a psychologist, there's some human nature component to that people give us something, we want to return the favor. If you think about it on its most basic level, when somebody says thanks to you, why do you instinctively say you're welcome? You don't have to. So there is definitely a reciprocation piece to it. The other piece to it, though, is when you are giving value, you are essentially establishing your credibility. You are establishing, depending what kind of value you're giving, establishing your expertise. You are establishing your brand in the sort of bigger ecosystem. You're also establishing yourself as someone who's trustworthy, who's generous, who's not just out to get, when people feel like they're being sold to, or they feel like you're trying to get stuff from them, their defenses go up. So when you are going to try to sell to them down the road, it's much, Gary Vaynerchuk talks about jab. His thing is like jab, 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 right hook. The idea being it's like give, and then ask. It's not that you don't ever ask. It's not that you don't ever try to sell. But that sales approach you make is going to be way more effective if you have provided a lot of value up front. Because again, every time you do that, your prospect or customer or client or whatever it is on the other end, they're lowering their defenses. And that lowering of their defenses is actually them starting to trust you and like you and know you. And, you're not just coming out of nowhere. And this is what I mean about email. Like this ties back into what I was saying about email marketing versus newsletters. A lot of people will start a newsletter that is just about their company. That's not a newsletter. That's email marketing. Right? If you're just saying, hey, we have a sale on this and buy this and here's our new thing. And, I was talking to a client the other day and we were just starting out and I was looking at like one of their most recent newsletters and, it did have a bunch of valuable stuff in it, but it also had, hey, we were mentioned in this magazine and hey, look at this win our client had. And, and I said, I was like, that's all great. And I get what you're trying to do and it's social proof that you're helping your clients and whatever, but why does the reader of your newsletter care? Why do they care that you were mentioned in this magazine?
Yeah.
Why do they care that you're, it's one thing on a sales page to go, hey, people who bought this got this result. But in an email newsletter, why do they care? I was like, it doesn't mean you can't mention it, but make it valuable. Don't just tell them, how, oh, we're in this magazine, because they actually work in the PR space. So I was like, if your audience is interested in getting publicity, tell them how you got in the magazine. They'll still realize you're in the magazine, but like what actually makes that relevant and valuable to them is how, right?
That is superb. That is very, very clever.
Yeah, don't just say, right, don't just say, look at this amazing result our clients got. Explain how they got it and exactly what they did and how they implemented the thing that you taught them or whatever to do it. So that's how you can, as long as you come from this filter that everything you're doing is designed to provide value to that audience, it's not that you can't talk about you. It's great. You should talk about your successes, but how do you take that and turn it into sort of relevant value and education for your audience?
Josh, you just reminded me. It's actually one of my last questions.
Okay.
I'm pulling it all the way to the very, very top now because I want to talk about this. One of the reasons that that you stood out so much of all the content I got. By the way, I will let you know how I came across. You'll never believe this.
Yeah.
Actually, it was one of the guys on my team in Russia who said, sent me an email and said, you got to look at this guy's email here.
That's so funny.
And it was, seriously. He said it was I think I was trying to find it. I can't find it in his emails because it was a link. And so I can't find the keyword, but I think it was the one about Facebook and how you wrote a thing on Facebook and generated
about getting clients,
massive volume. And then you wrote something else that supported that. And the term that I wrote that I wanted to talk to you about is very, very advanced concept. And you just touched on it again. It's the idea of layering, where you present something, you just describe it. And I do this all the time. Here's an article in NRER online that I just wrote. Of more interest to the reader actually is how the heck did I get an article on NREI online and how is it structured, right? That's of higher value. So let's talk about, before we get to layering, because I think that, I'm not sure if you think of it that way, but it's a very interesting approach. And one that is worth exploring in my field, which is how do we find investors as well. I'm not sure how we actually do that, but let's talk about the structure, your basic structure of a newsletter. And the way that I think of it, just because this is my kind of rudimentary way of doing it, is I start with telling my audience what I have. I try and explain the benefits of it, and then I put in a how to get it. So click here to read more kind of thing. And then I always try and send people back to my website so I can track behavior.
Mhm.
So it's all tracked, right? UTM codes and everything all the way. So what is how when you set about, actually, how do you advise clients to structure their emails?
So I think it depends. There's so many variables. Again, it depends what you're trying to accomplish. It depends who the audience is. It depends what the value is you're trying to give them. It depends on your own time and resources. And, I would sort of start here. At a very high level, there are three different types of newsletters. One is what I would call original, meaning it's going to be your own original writing, your own ideas. You're not linking to other articles. You're not linking to the New York Times thing. Like, it's just your thing, right? The other would be what I would call curated, which is the opposite end of the spectrum. You might be writing summaries, but it's basically a collection of links to news or resources or interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The third is basically a hybrid of those two, right? Which I would call blended, right? So in most cases, again, it depends, but in most cases, I nudge people towards blended. And the reason why I do that is if you are trying to establish your expertise in some way, which in most cases tied to your goals, you are either establishing your expertise or developing relationships with people. If you're only sharing curated stuff, it's a little tough to do that, right? The reason why I like doing blended and not just doing original is because I think blended allows you, without a lot more effort, to provide a lot more value. So if you have so let's say, like my newsletter, which is called For the Interested, people can get it at fortheinterested.com. Mine is blended. So my newsletter is geared towards helping creators produce, promote, and profit from their creations. So I essentially share 5 links every Sunday. The first one is always a link to an original blog post that I wrote. That's the original piece. The next 4 are curated. So it might be, here's a link to a really interesting podcast episode I found. Here's a New York Times article that's interesting, whatever. If I were to do only original and just essentially send the blog posts that I wrote each week, that could be great. It could be really valuable. It would establish me, but that's going to basically cover whatever that one topic is that I wrote about that week. By incorporating the curated stuff, if you learn how to curate stuff well, which is a whole other sort of conversation, but allows me to cover a broader scope of interest. So let's say the post I wrote this week was just about how to grow your newsletter. Any person that subscribes to my newsletter that doesn't have a newsletter doesn't care about that issue. It's not relevant. But by incorporating the 4 other curated, so my blog post might be, here's how to grow your newsletter. And then I might go, here's a link about how to monetize your podcast. And here's another link about how to better manage your time, which is super universal, relevant to everyone. Here's another thing about how to improve your YouTube titles, or, whatever it is. So those curated elements allow me, and this is sort of a separate thing, like my goal when I send a newsletter, this is another misconception I think a lot of people have. Let's say they're sending a collection of links or different things, right? They have 5 different things in it. Most people's goal is, I want as many clicks as possible on all those things. My goal is, I want you to find one thing that you love in each newsletter, because all I need is one. I need you to have one. If I share 5 things, I want every one of my readers to have one thing in it that they were like, that was great, I'm going to open the next one.
It's interesting you say that, because what I do actually is the only link, well, I track clicks for sure.
Yeah.
But the only link that I really, I actually add a few layers of code to are the ones that go back to my website. All right. So I have curated stuff as well. And actually what I also try to do is send everybody back to my website. So even the curated, I'll actually have links. The curated stuff actually is, in my case, for my stuff, is typically articles that I've written. But I'll send people back to my news page where there's all kinds of, pathways to other stuff, so that I can track and see what kind of behavior there is. But for clients, we do curated. We have a list of typically articles that reinforce the investment thesis.
Yeah.
whatever their investment thesis is. And I don't really track those. I can see who's clicked on them, but they're going off somewhere else.
Right.
They're gone. Once they've gone, they've gone.
Right. And ultimately all that really, again, like the click-throughs are sort of overrated. All that really matters is that you're giving people it just has to be value enough that they want to keep opening it and keep getting it.
Right.
Right. And so that's why I like blended, because you have your original stuff. You're able to bring in other stuff that sort of, without a ton of extra work, amplifies the value and sort of increases the chances that people are going to find something that they found valuable and liked. I also think, on a side note, just as a creator, the process of curating ideas, you learn a lot. And I think that's the other thing. It forces you out of your own bubble. And so for example, like with my newsletter, and I've been running it for like over, this week was, I think, the 225th issue. I have featured well over 2,000 ideas in the newsletter. So a small percentage of those are my own. And that's not counting all the ones that I read and found but didn't quite make the newsletter. So it means that I have consumed thousands of articles, videos, podcasts, ideas about how creators can grow audiences and monetize and all of that. It becomes a mass. I've consumed them. I've summarized them. Consumed them on a deep level and had to sort of communicate them. That is a massive, from just sort of a knowledge standpoint, that is a massive competitive advantage. And I think that's the interesting thing about running a newsletter, that I think anyone that has run a newsletter for an extended period of time completely agrees with the thing I'm about to say. Anyone who has not run a newsletter for a decent amount of time, this is not even on their radar as a potential value. My newsletter is the engine of my consulting business. It's gotten me clients. It's earned me revenue. It's built me a large audience. I have 25,000 subscribers. There's a lot about it that has been valuable. I don't think any of it has been as valuable as the knowledge it has allowed me to acquire. And I think that is a piece that, even if you had, because people can get very easily discouraged, right? They're doing this newsletter, they have 50 subscribers, they're like, I don't know what I'm getting out of this, it's a bunch of work. If you sort of put that to the side a little and go, this is actually a sort of knowledge practice for me, and that it giving you a competitive advantage because you are learning all this stuff that other people don't see. I mean, again, when I think about myself compared to sort of other consultants or people that are working with creators, most of them have not consumed 5,000 or 10,000 of these concepts and continually are doing so on a week-by-week basis. I'm constantly seeing and finding the new stuff, the new thing that someone did, the new trend, the new whatever, and building relationships with these other people who are putting their stuff out there. It's massively valuable, and people don't see it because they're bogged down looking at their subscriber account or how many sales it drives or leads or whatever.
Let me share something with you. First of all, it's really important insight. Over the last 3 weeks particularly, it's a long story and I won't get into it in too much detail, but I have dived deep into the history of marketing and been reading, I don't know how many, probably I've read over 2,000-3,000 pages of books over the last few weeks. And it is incredibly stimulating and fulfilling. And also, I wake up in the middle of the night. I have this little book. I put it next to my bed. It's actually okay. It's got this James thing. Yeah. But I scribble notes on it in the middle of the night. I don't want to turn my phone on and type notes because it is inspirational. But one of the biggest challenges, and this is a distinction or a differentiating a differentiator between what you do and what I do. You have a newsletter. Your newsletter is your business. And so what I think of it as layering. And I'd like to talk to you more about this. It's absolutely fascinating the way that you create content.
Mhm.
But if you have a newsletter about newsletters, then writing and studying about newsletters makes sense,
Mhm.
because everything you learn can go into your newsletter, and
Mhm.
right, it's just like it's this virtuous circle, right?
Mhm.
Everything that you do. When I think about writing an article or something in my newsletter about the Robert Collier letter book,
Mhm.
you know what? There's some really interesting insights into this, 1,000-page book, whatever, 500-page book. But I've got to sit down now, write an article, put it on my website, summarize it for my newsletter, and get it out. That's a lot of work. And for a busy real estate developer, there's no way that we could sustain that on a regular basis.
Mhm.
So how do you, if what you are sending out is not about newsletters, how do you create the content? What is the key? What are the best practices for
So
deciding what to write about?
let me give
You-
you a perfect example.
and sustaining it
Yep.
consistently. That's the key right there.
Let me give you a perfect example of a client of mine that is a business that could not be further from like newsletter content creator world, right? But as I've helped them launch a newsletter, it's been super successful. They work in the alarm monitoring call center space, right? So as I've come to learn, there's all these alarm companies all over the country. When people, both security and health, they're like, I've fallen and I can't get up type stuff. When those calls come in, those companies all basically outsource their calls to these call monitoring companies. There are a couple huge call monitoring companies. My client is one of the big ones. So they've got, their clients, their industry are these smaller alarm companies all around the country. They came to me, ironically, when the CEO of the company was a big fan of my newsletter, came to me, saw sort of value in newsletters, or was there, like, what could they do? He was very smart, and that this goes back to what I was saying before, that it was not about a company newsletter. He didn't want a newsletter that was talking about what the company was doing. It wasn't designed to be salesy. He was like, we have this industry. There's probably 5,000 to 10,000 people total in this sort of niche industry. There's not an industry trade paper. There's not a lot of coverage. He's like, it feels like we want to create a thing. We have relationships with maybe half the people in the industry. We want to create a thing that we can sort of connect to the other half, who ultimately can become clients and that kind of thing. We came up with, exactly like I was talking about before, basically a curated sort of industry newsletter, a little bit of original stuff because they're kind of tapped into it, but not in-depth long blog posts. But it's like they hear about a company that's being put up for sale or a thing, like they have some information and news that they can kind of break and then blend it with sort of curated stuff. Again, going back to goals, so they publish every other week, and it's literally a collection of like 4 to 5 links with summaries. It does take time.
That's it, though. That's all it is.
That's all it is. Very simple.
So they're not creating content; they're curating content in that case.
Basically, they're once in a while, depending, like if they will do like, oh, we'll do an interview with this guy. So they're creating a little bit of content.
That's a lot easier to do, isn't it? I mean, what you do is way more advanced than that.
Well,
but
this kind of is the point. This kind of goes back to what I said in the beginning, right? This assumption that you have to spend all this time, all you have to do is create value. So the hypothesis in sort of my work with them was, what can we create that your people in your industry will find valuable and will be a no-brainer to subscribe to? And that is exactly what we created. One of their concerns, which is also interesting, was going into it, they're like, well, how are we going to have stuff to curate? Because there's not a lot of coverage of our industry. Like what are we going to, it's not like we're in the, whatever, climate change, where there's like a million articles, like What are we going to do? And I think this is really important and
I
I
see.
think relevant to you and your audience as well.
Mm.
What I said to them was like, I understand that there's not a lot of coverage of the specifics of your industry, but there is a lot of coverage of all the issues that, you know, your industry is basically small business owners. So they need to know there's no shortage of coverage about how to market to senior citizens. There's no shortage of coverage about how to handle customer service complaints. There's coverage about how to deal with reopening offices after COVID. There's a million things, how to lay people off, how to do better hiring. Like there's a million universal struggles that they have. And we can curate that stuff and just tweak it towards your audience.
Very
and I think
interesting.
that is a massive opportunity that most people don't realize in their fields. So to sort of make a long story short, it has been massively successful for them. It is getting passed around. They had a bunch of email addresses. They had maybe like 1,000 or so email addresses of clients and people that they knew. They started there. They haven't done anything beyond that really. And it has spread by word of mouth. They get new subscribers every time.
Do they include a CTA in the email that says, if you like this, share it with a friend?
Yes. Yep.
And does that send you to a
sign-up page?
A sign-up page.
Yeah. And what's fascinating, and again, this is a thing that I think when they originally contacted me, they didn't see, but I sort of saw and pointed out to them early on. This is another thing. I mean, because you're talking about tracking link clicks. The market research of this is fascinating because, for example, if they put something in there about how to deal with layoffs, they can see who clicked that. They know that guy at that company is thinking about laying people off, right?
Right.
Or vice versa, right? A new product. Let's say there's a new product coming into the industry that they're going to be selling or they're going to be offering or whatever. They can see the people that are interested in that new product. That data can get passed to their salespeople. You know, when new people, and this has happened, new people join the newsletter because it gets passed around. There have been all these companies and people who work at companies that they didn't know exist. And now they're able to, their sales guys go, hey, this guy at, Acme Alarms just joined.
Right. Call him.
Here's the things and taking even a step further, here's the things he clicked.
Well, not only that, but if you use Google Analytics, you can see what pages they looked at on your website as well, how long they spent, right?
Yeah. So that is how, and again, that is an example of a thing that could not be further from the sort of media company thing. And that can be done in basically any niche really effectively.
All right. So I do want to talk to you about layering.
Yeah.
Before I do, I did want to make one point about your client with 50 subscribers.
Mm-hmm.
I used to teach at university, real estate investment and finance. I would teach classes of 50, right?
Mm-hmm.
They'll have these big lecture rooms. Most of them, and if anyone's listening, I'm not talking about you particularly, but the vast majority there'd be those on the back row who couldn't care less. They were on their laptops watching YouTube for all I could tell. The ones in the middle who were indifferent. Mm-hmm. And then there was usually 5 or 6, so about 10% that sat on the front row who were glued to absolutely everything I said. Those were the people that I lectured to.
Yep.
Right? Those were the people I taught. So 5 in one class. Mm-hmm. That is the equivalent. If you've got 50 people, that is the equivalent of lecturing to 500 people, but actually you've got 50 people who opted in that are hanging on every word. Yep. It's not a trivial number. It really isn't, right?
No, not at all. It's funny. I used to say this thing that the online metrics are so skewed, followers, view counts, whatever, and I would always say, I was like, if you actually think about, so here's what's fact. So I've done a lot of work with comedians and artists and musicians and those kind of things. And here's what's fascinating. They will put let's say a video up on YouTube. Comedian puts a video up on YouTube. It gets 500 views and they feel like it's a dud and crap and whatever, right? A sold out comedy club is maybe 300 people. So I was like, this video that you think is a dud reached twice as many people. Like if you performed in a sold out comedy club, you would be through the roof. Like, oh my God, I sold out the club, whatever.
And have you back to
as you reach with this video. And this video is not done. This video is going to continue to reach
forever,
even if it's a trickle of people forever. Yeah. You know, people think about these numbers, and when you actually transfer them to a sort of real world, and I'm guilty of it too, right? Like I go, oh, I have 25,000 subscribers, and like that feels great. You always look at people that have more or whatever. You know, that's a basketball arena full of people that every Sunday are open. You know, when you think about it, and the same thing, just like you were saying with 50 people, people go, 50 people. If you walked into a room with 50 people sitting there going, please tell me about your stuff.
Yeah, but that's the point, isn't it? It's not, if you walk into a room with 50 people, maybe half a dozen will be interested, but you're talking about a room of people that are all locked onto what you're saying. Right. All right, so listen, we're going to run out of time. I know I really would like to speak to you for a long time.
Yeah, go ahead.
I do have a couple of questions afterwards as well I want to touch on after we finish. But I do want to talk about this idea of layering a little bit, because it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's very, very advanced. Mm-hmm. And then I've got a few questions I want to ask that are kind of rudimentary. Of course, with you, they're not. Nothing is, right? It's all very advanced. But so this idea of layering. So I can't remember exactly what it was. I'm so sorry, but you touched on it earlier. Mm-hmm. Instead of putting an article, look at how great I am, I was quoted in this magazine. Yeah. Think about what your audience really wants. How do you give them benefit to that? Mm-hmm. And instead describe how it was you got listed in that article, for example. And to me, that to me is layering. That's cutting down and looking really what the benefits is. And I think what it was that you had was it was a newsletter that you put out that was something to do with how to write a newsletter on Facebook. And then, and I might be wrong, and then you wrote another article that described the process that had got you so many reads. It was brilliant because of the way it layered. Tell me about that thought process. How do we understand that a little bit more?
So I think there's two pieces to it. So first of all, in some ways, this isn't exactly what you're talking about, but I think a lot of times I am huge on, I think I call it repurposing. And so I'm big on repurposing content. I'm also big on the sort of what I call like the elasticity of content, that big things can be pulled apart into small things can be expanded into big things. Another major thing I'm a proponent of, these are all sort of related. I'm also a huge proponent of evergreen content, meaning creating content that is basically timeless. When you're talking about the news of the day, which I basically never do, right? The lifespan of which you have, if I talk about, let's say if I talk about what Trump did today, and I don't get into politics, any of that, but if I do that, or whatever the news of the day is, right? A new law was passed today, let's say, right? Let's put it in your terms, right? There's a new, interest rates change or whatever, right? The lifespan of the value of that piece of content that I put time and effort into creating is basically a day, because it's going to become outdated, right? It's going to become old news. It's going to whatever. If I instead create a piece of content that is the mindset it takes to invest in real estate, or like, maybe it's like the parameters to assess whether something's a good investment. I'm making this up, right? That is likely every bit as valuable a year from now, 5 years from now, as it is today. So when you create evergreen content, you expand the potential ability you have to get value from it, which means ultimately in the long run, you're going to get more value from it. Now, the example that you were talking about, I think, and you'll see, like, I do this with a lot of stuff. There's a lot, to use your term, there's a lot of different layers to it, and I'm constantly sort of recycling it. So in some ways, it starts with this. I've had a lot of clients who are comedians. I used to work in the comedy world. I'm familiar with sort of what their concerns are. I created a blog post that actually took a bunch of excerpts from other things. I might have been like, oh, here's how to use Twitter, and here's how to do this, and here's how to, don't do what celebrities do, like all these different pieces. Pulled it into one post aimed directly at comedians. It was called like how to, I forget what the title was, but it was, I think it was social media strategies for comedians that actually work.
Very clever. Yeah.
It was this big post. And literally in the post, in my mind, in the back of my mind, I was like, this post is designed to provide value to a very specific audience, and I want them to also know that they can hire me, right? So in the intro, I sort of talked about, I've done this for years, and I've had all these conversations, and sort of here's like the ultimate kind of guide to using social media. And I didn't hold back the secrets. I put it all out there, which goes to what we said before. So that's the first piece. I then took that post and used Facebook ads to promote it to comedians, right? So it worked really well. I was targeting comedians. The ads were, again, you want to speak directly to the specific audience that you want to reach. So, hey, comedians, if you're trying to figure out how to blah, 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 like check this out. It's free. It's not a sales pitch. It's not anything, right? People would go read it. Some of them would reach out to me and want to talk about hiring me, and some of them ultimately would hire me. And here's where the layering comes in. So in some ways, we're already a couple layers deep. Once I saw that that sort of worked, I went and wrote another blog post that basically explained exactly how I did it. I wrote a blog post that said, here's how, and I think that the title of that post was like, how to use a blog post, a Facebook ad, and $100 to get clients. So I think I spent $100 on the
This is the one I'm talking about.
Right.
This is it.
So that post was basically like, I explained how I wrote the blog post. I explained how I ran the ads to promote it. I showed, again, showing everything. Like this idea that you're going to hold back the secrets is always a mistake. Mm-hmm. Put it out there. I showed how I ran the ads. I showed what the ads were. I talked about the results I got. This many people clicked. This many people reached out to talk about hiring me. This many people actually hired me. You could easily adapt this to just about anything. Now, again, layers deeper, which you probably haven't even seen. So when people subscribe to my newsletter, the welcome email they get asks them a question to basically like, tell me about what you create. Maybe I can help you promote it. Not salesy, just like I want to know. Side note, people are blown away that anyone ever asks them about themselves. Like, oh, there's a person here. So a percentage of those people reply and they go, oh, I'm a blah, blah, blah. And I'm trying to do, some of those people, a lot of those people, they may be comedians, or they may be, I'm a yoga instructor trying to get clients. I'm a whatever. Every one of those people that say anything about comedy or getting clients, I reply back to them. And I go, hey, well, I reply to everybody. I reply to everybody and go, hey, here's a few things. Oh, it's really interesting that you're doing X, Y, and Z. Here's a few things that you might find helpful. And I link them to various things that I've written before. So that's yet, in some ways, that's yet another layer of this. So if you think about, to go back to the layering example, it started with paying attention to sort of what I was doing in my business and things that I thought people were trying to figure out. That's layer one. Layer two is creating the blog post that basically addresses those things. Layer three is running a Facebook ad to drive people to that blog post. Layer four is writing another blog post about that. Right. And layer five is now using it to build an instant connection and provide instant value, more importantly, to people who subscribe that it's relevant to. And arguably layer six, or I've lost count at this point, is us talking about it on this podcast.
Now we're going to create half a dozen videos from this, a dozen notable quotables. We'll get it on social media.
Right. And if I wanted to, I could, after this, go create another blog post that's like how writing a thing gives you something to talk about on a podcast. Right? And on it goes. The other thing, which I haven't even mentioned, and I do this with all of my stuff, every blog post I write, this goes to the elasticity part. I pull apart and post individual sentences and stuff as tweets. Yeah. So I'm very active on Twitter, and I post on top of this, but I schedule 5 tweets a day, every day. And it's basically my greatest hits because they're all excerpts from blog posts and articles I've written. Taking a step further, at this point, I know they're excerpts that people like because they're stuff that people highlighted or shared or responded to. So that's, again, another example of this layering where like people sort of go like, how do you, it's funny because on the outside, they don't know, right? So, and again, I can do this because it's evergreen. If it was timely content, I can't tweet about the thing that happened 6 years ago.
Exactly. It has to be timeless.
But
Josh,
when it's evergreen, I can. And people look at me and they go, how do you tweet so much? I'm like, actually, it's really easy. Like I'm just repurposing this stuff. Yeah. And then also looking at how it does, and the ones that do really well, I'll recycle again 6 months from now. Or
Gosh, I'm going to have to, I really do want to talk to you.
Yeah, no problem.
Like hours and hours, but we simply can't.
Yes, I know.
And we're going to have to roll up. And I do want to talk to you offline afterwards as well, ever so briefly, if you don't mind. So I've got I usually finish my podcast with 3 questions. I am going to finish those. Those are just lightning round.
Okay.
But if you will, please humor me.
Yeah.
I've been writing a few questions. You're not going to like them. I'll just tell you that right now.
Great. Okay. Go ahead.
Lightning round of questions about newsletters.
All right. I'll be quick.
Forgive me for asking these. All right. But this is a lightning round. And then I've got my own questions to ask you. All right. How often, you touched on this before, the debate that I had with a client this morning, we did some, I shouldn't get too deep into it, otherwise you don't want anyone to figure out who it is, but so it would be indiscreet. So the debate was, we've been sending every week a newsletter. I send mine every week. I send it every week because I like to track behavior.
Yeah.
And the more I send, the more it stimulates behavior on my website, and I can create hot lists and various other benefits from doing that. To follow up with. But how should you decide how often to send? By the way, this is a lightning round, Josh, so.
I will be quick. I like weekly or twice a month. I think if you go less than, I think ultimately you're trying to build a habit. I also think it's important to send at the same time. So if you send every Monday or every Wednesday or whatever, or every other Wednesday, whatever it is, you want to be consistent. I don't think you can build a habit, or for that matter, really a consistent relationship if you're doing it less than once every 2 weeks.
2 weeks. But what about the difference between once a week and once every 2 weeks? Is there do you think?
I think if you can.
Are you bugging people if it's weekly versus?
Well, you're never bugging them if you're providing value, and if you've told them up front what they're going to get. So I like, in an ideal world, my newsletters are always weekly. I like weekly. I think that's the ideal. That said, if you think that's going to be difficult for you from a work level, I would go every other week.
That aside, if you think is it going to bug your list?
I'm not worried about it bugging the audience, because as long as it's good, it's not going to bug them, and they know what they're signing up for when they get into it, right? I'm more worried about you not being able to
having the capacity to do it. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. Yep. Should I worry about sending? And by the way, this came up. This is a live discussion that I'm having right now. I actually don't, but I haven't pushed the point. So I want to ask you as a world expert on this. Should I worry about sending every week because I might get unsubscribes?
You're always going to get unsubscribes. And the bigger your list, the more subscribers, the more, I get 50 people unsubscribe every time I send my newsletter. I have a lot of subscribers. It's just part of it. The only time you should worry about unsubscribes is if your net is dropping, like if you're continuing to get more and more. As long as your unsubscribes are relatively consistent, I think you're okay. So you should pay attention to them, but you should not, but if you're seeing more and more higher percentages unsubscribing every time, that's not a great sign.
2 more questions. Yep. The second of these 2.
But just really quickly, it's probably a reflection of the newsletter, not the frequency.
Yeah, and
they're unsubscribing because they don't love what they're getting. If the unsubscribes are going up,
right,
it's not because you're
yes, that's a problem. But if it's a flat line, if it's the same number every week, it doesn't really matter. Format, with or without pictures?
I typically do 1 or 2 pictures at most. I'm not an expert on email deliverability, but the more images you put in, the more likely you are going to wind up in spam filters. So 2 things. Number 1 is that. Number 2 is also, the more polished it feels, the less personal it feels. And in most cases, you want personal because you're going for connection. You don't want it to feel too corporate.
Last question. You're going to hate me for this one.
Huh?
At the end of a 56th minute of a 1 hour conversation.
Fire away.
Best practices for subject lines.
Depends on, well, the short, cheeky answer, I guess, is whatever's going to get you opens. But
Okay, good.
I think it depends a little bit on what it is. What I don't like doing, assuming you have multiple different things covered in the newsletter, I don't love tying it to just one topic because I think you're all or nothing. So if it's a one topic newsletter, that's different. But if it's if like mine, if I'm covering 5 things, I'm never just going to title it like how to grow your YouTube channel when there's like 4 other things that are not that. Because I think people will just not open it if they, so that would be my one tip, sort of. Sometimes a little vague can help too. You're trying to tease them to open it. You don't necessarily need to reveal it all.
Okay. That's such a huge question because it's all about headlines. It's very powerful. Subject line does it all. Okay, last sign-off questions, lightning round. For somebody thinking of setting up a newsletter, right? They've not got one at the moment. What would be the most, again, this is my industry, as we talked about. What would be the most important thing they should keep in mind?
Get very clear on your target. I actually have a line somewhere about this where it's like, you fill in this sentence. I want to help fill in the blank target audience get from fill in the blank point A to fill in the blank point B. Very basic, right? If you can fill that out. So, again, let's say it's, I want to help high income people get from their money sitting in a bank to it earning more than they could earn in the stock market or whatever. Your newsletter as you're figuring out what should this newsletter be, it's all aligned to that. So everything that you're doing, you're thinking about how does this help those people get from this place to that place? And I think if you sort of keep that in mind versus what a lot of people might be tempted to do is, I'm going to start a real estate newsletter. Like, no, you're going to start a newsletter for high income people who want to get from this place to that place. And that guides everything that you do.
Fantastic.
Yep.
Second to last question. What's been the hardest lesson you've learned on your path to newsletter excellence?
That's a good question. I don't know if it's exactly I started a bunch of newsletters before my sort of current incarnation. So I've had a bunch of stops and starts. I guess the one thing I would say, and I don't know if this counts as a hard lesson, but it's certainly an important lesson. Newsletter is a long game. It's not a short game. Consistency matters. It does have compounding value and interest over time. And I think it's very easy for people to get discouraged very quickly. And if you're just doing it for the results, you're probably going to have a hard time sticking with it because the results aren't going to come immediately. And this is one of the other things I say all the time is I think that you want to go into, especially in the beginning, focus on output as opposed to outcome. So when you start it, go, I'm going to send 20 issues. I'm going to send this for 6 months or whatever it is. And I don't care if nobody subscribed. Like that's how you're measuring it. And you go, I'm going to commit to doing this for 6 months. At the end of 6 months, I will reassess. Because I also think that's helpful to give yourself an out because otherwise people are constantly wondering like, should I quit? Should I not quit? It's like, no, I'm doing 6 months and then I'm going to assess and see if I want to keep going because at that point you don't feel like a quitter or failure.
It's interesting that you say, I think that's very wise advice. When I started on this path to digital marketing, I had no idea where it was going to lead.
Yeah.
I just decided I'm going to commit to it. I'm going to give as much as I possibly can. Mm-hmm. And then I'm going to figure out as I see where the path takes me, where I'm going, actually basically where it's going to lead me.
And I also think if you wrap your head around if you go into it thinking that part of the value I'm seeking to get out of this is knowledge and learning. This is an excuse. It's like going to the gym, right? Like this is an excuse for me to sort of be exposed to stuff. That takes some of the pressure off of like, it kind of doesn't matter if your subscribers aren't growing as fast as you want, or it's not turning into business. Like there is another bucket of value you're getting out of it. And so I think that can be helpful to sort of keep that in mind as you start.
Very good. Last question. What are your key daily habits that make you successful?
Wow. I go for a walk every morning for 30 minutes. Basically like before I start working. And I find that sometimes I'll listen to podcasts, sometimes I'll listen to music. That is super helpful. Honestly, it's a kind of a weird answer, but like doing this newsletter every week for 225 weeks in a row, what I've learned from it, how it has led business and clients to me, how it has led to conversations like this, how it has led to relationships with other creators and other stuff. I said before, I think like that, and it's interesting because the newsletter is not, I make my money from consulting. Like the newsletter itself is not really like the direct revenue for me, but it is the engine of everything. So that is the one thing, like even when I'm thinking like maybe I want to work with different kind of clients or offer a different product or different service, like that stuff all varies. The thing that never varies is I'm writing this newsletter and it's coming out on Sunday. Like that is the non-negotiable, like it is the sort of foundation of stuff for me. So that would probably be the thing I would say.
Josh Spector of joshspector.com. You've also got another website. You mentioned it earlier.
fortheinterested.com.
fortheinterested.com. It's superb. I strongly commend it. Josh, enormous pleasure. Thanks so much for being on my podcast.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun.
That was Josh Spector at joshspector.com, and what a fascinating fellow he is. Can you imagine that? Developing a business that is premised entirely on sending newsletters. Very, very interesting. It's definitely important for you too, because staying in touch with your prospects and with the people that are subscribed to you and with your active investors is vitally important, particularly in between deals. You want to keep them warm, keep them educated, and stay in touch. So newsletters are a great way of doing that. And to prove the point, be sure to go to gowercrowd.com and sign up for my newsletter. So you get the Wednesday update on real estate crowdfunding news around the industry, and then the Saturday educational newsletter as well. It's right, completely free. Go ahead there, gowercrowd.com, where you will also find information on Josh and how to access that article on comedians that I mentioned before. You will find it fascinating the way that he structured that. That's it. Thanks so much for listening. And thank you, Josh Spector at joshspector.com, for your time with me today. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I love being on your email list. Thanks so much for that too. That's all for this episode. I'll see you next time. And in the meantime, stay well. And for now, this is Dr. Adam Gower signing off.